Welcome to Secret Story, Josh, of course I'll marry you. Sophie exclaimed loudly as she threw her arms around Josh and hugged him tightly. Grinning from ear to ear, she squeezed him tightly as his arms wrapped around her and lifted her from the ground. Thank you, baby, you've just made me the happiest guy in the world. Josh said ecstatically, as he spun her around and then gently set her back on her feet in the lounge. Sophie looked from the diamond engagement ring in her hands up to her loving boyfriend, now fiancé, and beamed with pure joy. And I'm the luckiest girl in the world, Josh Seymour, she said, before leaning up and gently kissing him. Slowly releasing her lips from Josh's. Sophie sat down gently on the sofa admiring the ring in her hand. Josh knelt down in front of her and took her left hand in his, and gently slid the diamond ring onto her engagement finger. Then, he looked up at her smiling lovingly and Sophie smiled adoringly back at him. He was so handsome. I love you, she said, while she looked deep into his eyes. I love you too, baby, he replied just as lovingly. The adoring couple sat and stared at each other for a few more minutes before Sophie broke the eye contact by once again looking down at the ring that now adorned her finger, making her officially engaged to Josh. She could have jumped up and down with excitement and sheer joy, but right then she just couldn't believe this was actually happening. It was like her fairy tale dream, but this was actually happening. The ring glittered on her finger as it sat proudly next to her eternity ring, and she just sat there and smiled dreamily at it. This was all actually real, she just couldn't believe it. There's only one slight problem though, babe, Josh said hesitantly, and Sophie looked up still smiling. Nothing would bring her down today. What's that, baby? Sophie asked, as she gently stroked down his cheek. Josh looked at her nervously before he obviously reached a decision to get whatever he wanted to say out of the way, and then he spoke. I want to get married in 3 weeks, he said quickly, then moved slightly back expecting some kind of tirade from Sophie. Sophie laughed lightly and stroked his cheek again tenderly. She loved him so much she could just cuddle him up right then and never let him go. Why would that be a problem? She asked amidst her gentle laughter. Seeing her happy mood, Josh visibly relaxed and smiled at her again. So, you're not annoyed, he said finally. Why would I be annoyed at that? She asked while laughing some more. He was so cute. It's just, I know you've had this fairy tale wedding planned since you were a kid, and well, I just want to be married to you as soon as I can. I'd marry you tomorrow if I could, but I know you want a big wedding, and it needs all that planning and things, and I didn't know if 3 weeks was enough time. He began to babble. Sophie just laughed gently and laid her fingers over his mouth. Shoo, she said with a warm smile, yes, I'll marry you, and yes, I'll marry you in 3 weeks. Josh relaxed completely now and smiled again as Sophie withdrew her fingers from his lips. Is 3 weeks going to be enough time to plan everything? He asked as he held her hands now between his. You just leave all of that planning to me, babe, and I'll make sure that 3 weeks is plenty of time. I can't wait to be married to you, she said, when a thought hit her suddenly, only, when we get married, my name will be Sophie Seymour. Oh, Josh said as he looked down, then quickly raised his head to smile amusedly at her. That doesn't really go, does it? Sophie smiled back at him with her own amused smile and shook her head. Well, how about I just take your name instead then, and then you can stay with your own name? Josh asked her. Once again, a broad smile crossed Sophie's beautiful features, and she grabbed Josh and kissed him. Sophie and Josh Harper, Sophie said wonderingly, yeah, that sounds good. Mr. and Mrs. Josh Harper. I like the sound of that. Me too, Josh replied, before he kissed her again, only this time he gently pushed her back onto the sofa until she was lying down. She was happier than she had ever been, and this night was just about to get that much better. Josh stood in the lounge buttoning his jeans back up and looking down at Sophie, his now fiancée, and smiled. She was always great in everything she did, and she had lived up to her great reputation again. Sophie sat up on the edge of the sofa. Instead, she stood up with a happy, satisfied smile on her flushed face and faced him. Say, I'm going to go and have a shower. Want to join me? She asked with a coy smile. Well, now, that is a tempting offer. Josh began to say and was cut off as the phone rang. Looking down at the caller ID, Josh saw who it was before picking the receiver up without answering and turning to look back down at his gorgeous fiancée. I'll be up in a minute, he said. Don't be too long, she replied huskily, before gently kissing him and walking out of the lounge. Josh watched her as she walked out of the lounge and returned her smile when she smiled over her shoulder at him. Then, after she walked out of the room, Josh answered the phone. Josh had gotten his big promotion a few days ago from Charles Riley, and with his new promotion, Riley had given Josh a brand new office next to his. Josh was now manager of his department and had received a huge bonus and a substantial new raise, enough so they had even talked about buying a new house in a wealthier part of Gainesboro. The reason for the promotion was Josh's success with the contract a couple of weeks ago, the very night Sophie had first Riley, and Sophie with the old man had had nothing to do with it. But before Riley had given Josh his new office, he had wanted to show Sophie what it was like, to get her approval, as she would know what Josh's tastes were, Riley had said. Sophie wasn't fooled by any of it, so she wasn't surprised when it turned out that all Josh's boss wanted to do was to her in Josh's new office before he got it. Sophie also knew that the reason why Josh's office was next to Riley's wasn't because he wanted to be kept close at hand, like Riley had told him, but so when Riley and Sophie in his office, Josh would be able to hear without knowing who was in with Riley. Sophie quickly she forced the thoughts from her mind. Instead, she focused on being married to Josh. And having a shower. She would be completely faithful to Josh, she tried to make herself believe, but whenever those thoughts managed to drift back into her mind, she knew that she wouldn't be, that after the poker night she was a cheating. After a few more minutes of struggling not to think about cheating on Josh, and trying to wash herself, all of her illicit thoughts fled as she heard Josh coming into the ensuite. Hey, baby, are you coming in? She asked teasingly, wanting him to come and take her again. Sorry, babe, I can't, Josh answered sounding excited. That was Billy on the phone. Sophie wasn't angry that Josh wouldn't come into the shower, only a little frustrated. But that completely disappeared when she heard Josh say Billy's name. She continued to finish up her shower as she spoke. Oh, wow, how is he, babe? What's he up to? Sophie asked enthusiastically. Billy was Josh's younger brother, and although, like Sophie's family, Josh's family lived in Shorehaven, Billy didn't. He was an Air Force pilot stationed in some foreign country for most of the year, and only very rarely did he ever get leave. Sometimes when he did get leave, he couldn't get back home, and so consequently, she had only met him twice in the 3 years that she and Josh had been together. He was a great guy, funny and smart, just like Josh. He was also great fun to be around. And the 2 times Sophie had met him they had all gone out with Josh's family and friends and the night had been amazing fun. Billy was just one of those guys who was good to be around. He's on leave, and he's at the airport right now, Josh said excitedly, and he was wondering if he could come over and stay with us tonight, because he wants to make his coming home a surprise for the family. Then he'll be staying at home for the rest of his leave. What do you think? Sophie smiled at how sweet Josh was. Of course, he can stay here, baby, we have a spare room, and it'll be great to see him again, she said sweetly to her fiancé, and reached to turn the shower off before stepping out into the warm air. It was another warm spring night, and the bathroom window was open, but Josh was standing holding her dressing gown for her and she smiled lovingly at him, and she felt all warm inside. He was so sweet to her. Maybe being faithful wasn't going to be so hard after all, because every time she looked at Josh, she felt no desire for anyone else. As she put her dressing gown on and tied the belt around her small waist, Josh continued. Cool, I'll go phone him and tell him. He'll be here soon, but I think he'll be tired from traveling, so we'll leave going out until tomorrow or something, with the rest of the family, yeah? Josh spoke quickly, obviously anxious to phone Billy to tell him to come over. Sophie laughed lightly. "Yeah, okay, baby, you better go and phone him and let him know then." "I'll go and get changed," she said with a loving smile. Josh quickly kissed her before hurrying off downstairs like a kid on Christmas morning. Josh got on with everyone in his family and missed them all, except his father, who he didn't get on with very well at all, and who seemed to return the feeling. Josh had never been very forthcoming with why, but still when Billy came back, they all managed to enjoy being around each other. Sophie smiled after him and shook her head slightly. He was adorable, and she loved him so much. Then she walked through into the bedroom to get changed. Sophie took her time drying her long blonde hair, which fell straight naturally, and combed it thoroughly before going to the wardrobe to decide what to wear. After getting changed, Sophie stood in front of the full-length mirror in her and Josh's bedroom while she pulled her hair up into a ponytail. Finally, after tying her hair up, and making sure that her long, blonde ponytail hung central and down her back, and swung freely when she moved her sweet head, Sophie turned to walk downstairs to be with Josh, and wait for Billy to turn up. "Hey," Sophie said cheerily to Josh as she walked into the lounge, "when's he going to be here?" "He should be here soon," Josh replied in anticipation. He really was looking forward to seeing Billy again. "Should be about 5 or 10 minutes, I think." "All right, then," Sophie said with a smile, "I'll go make a coffee." "What does he have?" "Oh, strong black with no sugar, I think," Josh replied, as he continued to peek through the window towards the driveway, "for spoons of coffee, I think." Sophie had been heading through the glass doors into the kitchen when she heard Josh say how much coffee his brother had and stopped. "For spoons?" she asked incredulously. "Are you sure? That's enough to keep him up half the night." "Yeah, for spoons," Josh replied, still peeking out of the window. "He's always liked the taste of coffee, and he said it helps him think quicker, or something like that anyway." "But it definitely is for." "Whoa," Sophie said, sounding amazed, and then she turned to walk into the kitchen to put the kettle on for the coffee. The kettle had just finished boiling when she heard Josh shout, "He's here," and then the front door opened, and Josh was out to meet his brother. She smiled and gently shook her head. He really was so cute. Once again, she felt warm inside from the thought of knowing that she was now engaged to Josh, and that she was going to marry him in 3 weeks. She was so lucky. She had just finished stirring the coffees when she heard 2 male voices, one Josh's and the other obviously belonged to Billy. They were laughing and talking as Sophie picked up all 3 cups and walked through into the lounge. The sight of Josh's beaming face made Sophie feel all warm inside as she once again stepped through into the lounge. He was so handsome, and then her eyes fell on the slightly shorter man standing next to her loving fiancé, his younger brother, Billy Seymour. Billy was only an inch shorter than his brother, and shared the same good looks as ran in Josh's family, but where Josh was comfortably dressed, Billy was perfectly smart in his pristine Air Force uniform of dark blue. His dark hair was gelled back and his face cleanly shaven, and even though his build was not as big as his older brother's, there was no mistaking the fitness of the physique under that pressed uniform. The stunning white grin of Billy's, that had won over so many of his female conquests that he told his family in tales at their get-togethers, turned from seeing Josh to looking directly at Sophie, and she could understand why so many women had given in to this man. Billy's grin made her insides flutter and brought a slight blush to her smooth cheeks. "Well, hi, Soph," Billy said to her as he let go of Josh's right hand and turned towards her. "Hi, Billy," Sophie replied, as she gently placed the coffee mugs on the table in the middle of the room, trying to hide her blushing cheeks. As she straightened up, Billy opened his arms wide, clutching his Air Force hat in his left hand. "How about a hug?" he said happily. Sophie smiled back broadly, trying not to look like she was blushing at all, and lightly placed her arms around him and hugged him. As Billy hugged her briefly, Sophie could feel the hardness of his body underneath his uniform, and the strength in his grip, even though he didn't particularly squeeze her tightly. As Sophie moved backwards, Billy stopped her with his hands holding onto hers, and looked over her body, before once again looking back at her beautiful face. "I have to say, Soph, you get more beautiful every time I see you," he said honestly, before turning to smile at his brother. "Josh, you sure are a lucky guy." "I know," Josh replied to his brother, and lovingly smiled over at her. Sophie felt like blushing again. But this time from the warmth she felt inside. It was just then that she realized that Billy was still lightly holding onto her hands, so she looked at him and smiled. He answered with a smile back at her that set her stomach aflutter, and once again brought crimson to her cheeks. She looked down quickly, trying to hide the effect Billy's smile had on her from him, and tried to think of something to say, but Billy spoke first. "Josh, I've got so much to tell you," he said, as he let go of her hands and turned once again to his brother. "I know, so have I, bro," Josh replied, looking ready to explode from impatience. "So, let me go first, okay?" "Okay," Billy said, looking slightly confused. "You might want to sit down, Bill," Josh said, as he tried suppressing his smile. The look of confusion deepened on Billy's face, but seeing Josh's suppressed smile he knew it couldn't be bad news. Sophie tingled inside too, with anticipation for Josh's words. "Okay, so what's the important news?" Billy asked interestedly. Josh gave Sophie a quick look before speaking. "Me and Sophie are engaged," he blurted out finally. Billy's face immediately turned from interest to over-the-moon joy for them both, and he leapt to his feet and grasped Josh's hand and shook vigorously. "Congratulations, big brother," he exclaimed. "To both of you," he said with a broad grin shared between Josh and Sophie. "Thanks, man," Josh said, equally ecstatic, "but that's not it. We're getting married in 3 weeks." Billy's eyes went even wider, and his grin broadened even more. "3 weeks," he replied, completely astonished. "Does everyone know?" "Not yet. You're the first we've told. We only got engaged tonight," Josh replied, his face a picture of perfect happiness made Sophie feel even warmer inside. "You're serious? In 3 weeks, my big brother's going to be married?" Billy said incredulously. "Yep, in 3 weeks me and Soph are going to be husband and wife," Josh exclaimed, and they both erupted in laughter and shouts as they gave each other a huge hug. As Sophie watched her fiancé and his younger brother hug and celebrate, she felt the contentment of knowing that soon she and Josh would be married. It was unbelievable. Finally, after 3 years, they had gotten engaged, and in 3 weeks they would be getting married. Sophie, a bride. She had so much to plan, so much to do, she just couldn't wait. As she sat on the arm of the sofa with her back to the kitchen, Sophie decided that her slut days were over. She was engaged to Josh now and would soon be marrying him. Yes, she had definitely decided that she would stay faithful to him now. She would. Billy sat in the leather armchair facing his brother and his soon-to-be sister-in-law, holding his mug of coffee, and occasionally taking a swig. 4 spoons of coffee. Just the way he liked it. He sat listening to Josh talking about what had been happening recently in his life and tried to keep his eyes from looking too often at his older brother's fiancée. He had met Sophie only a couple of times before, and every time she had been more stunning than the image he remembered. This time when he had saw her walking in with the coffee mugs, it wasn't only his posture that was standing at attention. He couldn't help but let his eyes flicker occasionally over to the blonde girl sitting next to his brother. And then there was her gorgeous face, framed perfectly by her long, blonde hair, held back in a ponytail that bobbed and swung whenever she moved her head. Her large, blue eyes looking innocent at the same time. She truly was a goddess in the flesh, and Billy Seymour sure wouldn't mind worshipping her. He had dreamed about Sophie ever since the first time he had seen her, but she was his brother's girlfriend, and he could never do that to Josh. His dad had one of Josh's girlfriends before, and that's why the two never spoke, but Billy would never do that to the brother he loved. Once again, he tried to keep his eyes on Josh. "So, what's been happening with you, little bro? Found yourself a nice woman yet?" Josh asked him with an insinuating look on his face. Billy couldn't help but laugh. Everyone knew of his reputation with the ladies. Even his family. "No, not yet, bro," he answered almost shyly. "In fact, I've been keeping away from the ladies for a couple of weeks because there hasn't been any of interest." Completely true. He had been on base for a few months, and lately there just didn't seem to be any women around, which was why looking at Sophie he tried as hard as he could. Although he had never liked Josh's ex anything like the way he liked Sophie. "You." "Come on, Billy," Josh said incredulously. He smiled back and noticed Sophie's cheeks redden. "Honest, man," he protested, "I would've if I'd seen a girl worth it, but honestly, not like your Sophie here." Sophie's face brightened and blushed once more as he smiled at her again. "Oh, come on, Billy, I'm sure you've seen women than me around the world," she said shyly. Billy smiled again, knowing full well how that charming smile of his affected women. "Honestly, Soph," he replied, before taking another swig of his coffee. Once again, the blonde beauty reddened and looked shy. Billy didn't think that this girl even knew how to be embarrassed about her looks. She didn't seem arrogant, but she had shown in the past that she knew she was beautiful. "He is right, though, Soph," Josh said proudly. This time Sophie just smiled, and lightly kissed Josh's cheek. "Yeah, well, this girl thinks that we haven't celebrated our engagement properly yet, so I'm going to get a bottle of champagne. Anybody want any?" Josh's blonde fiancée said, as she stood up. "Yeah, good idea, babe," Josh said enthusiastically. "Billy?" Billy looked from his brother to Sophie and smiled again. "Sure, I'm not going anywhere tonight anyway," he said to the hot blonde, warring with the thoughts in his mind. Smiling, Sophie quickly turned and walked through the glass doors and into the kitchen. With his at attention. His smile affected her, so he would see how far he could push her in the situation. After all, really, it would be a good thing for Josh, to know if his bride-to-be would stay faithful to him. But Billy knew that he didn't want her to. She was his older brother's fiancée, and he knew it would be wrong, so as Josh resumed the conversation. His younger brother planned how to his gorgeous fiancée. Sophie let out a long breath when she had walked into the kitchen and round past the counter. She remembered Billy being charming, and knew what his smile did to women, but she never remembered him causing her to get so embarrassed so much. "Get a hold of yourself, girl," she quietly said to herself as she tried to calm herself down. "You're engaged now." Sophie took a moment, as she looked through the fridge to find the good champagne she was looking for, to get herself together. "There's no need to blush like a schoolgirl every time he smiles at you," she said to herself as she picked up 2 bottles, "he does have a nice smile. And he is charming, but I've had more than that from other guys lately, and I haven't acted like this before. I'm engaged now, and I've got to be a good girl, but there's nothing wrong with harmless flirting, so stop acting like a girl looking at her first crush." Feeling a little more relaxed, Sophie lifted the bottles out from the fridge and stood looking at them. Which one?" she said thoughtfully, before replacing the larger of the 2 bottles and closing the fridge. "Good choice, but they both look good to me," came the sound of a male voice from by the counter. Looking up quickly, and slightly jumping, Sophie looked over to see Billy standing with his arms folded and smiling at her. She hoped he hadn't heard anything that she had said to herself. Smiling warmly, and quickly to hide any shock, and to make sure he didn't notice her wondering if he had heard, Sophie replied, "Yeah, but this one is the better tasting one, even if it is stronger." Billy's smile never changed, but Sophie thought she caught a glint of amusement in his hazel eyes. "I wasn't referring to the wine," he said simply whilst still smiling. Sophie immediately caught on, and with a playful smile, "I'm glad you like them," she replied playfully as she looked up, "at least you'll enjoy the scenery while you're here tonight." "I'm enjoying it a lot," Billy replied, and Sophie smiled deeper. "I can tell," she said. Billy instantly noticed where Sophie's gaze was aimed and blushed slightly. Sophie laughed lightly as she walked past Josh's younger brother, stopping briefly to lean slightly towards his ear. Down boy, she whispered playfully before laughing lightly again, and continuing to walk towards the lounge. We'll need some glasses and some ice, she said without looking back as she walked through the glass doors. Sophie smiled to herself as she walked around and placed the bottle on the coffee table, before sitting down next to Josh on the sofa facing the chair Billy had been sitting in. It's good to have him here, isn't it, babe? Her loving fiancé remarked. Yeah, it sure is. Baby, she replied as she smiled lovingly at him. Josh returned his fiancée's warm smile before changing the track of the CD that he must have put on before Sophie had come back into the lounge. Sophie hardly noticed the track change, however, as her thoughts were all on how she was feeling, and to her surprise, Josh's younger brother. It felt good to be flirting again. She would have to take care of that soon. And it would be Josh and no one else from now on. She was engaged now, and she would remain faithful. But flirting with Billy was harmless, and she was sure Josh would appreciate wrapping her arms around Josh. Sophie smiled warmly at her sweet fiancé. He would be getting the best lay of his life tonight. Josh smiled back at his loving fiancé. He still couldn't believe that they were actually going to get married in a few weeks. He had known that he had loved Sophie a few weeks into the relationship, and now she was officially going to be his forever. He felt as if the warm feeling of happiness was shining from him brightly. You look happy, babe, Sophie said softly, as she smiled lovingly at him. I've got you, that's why, he said warmly, as he gently kissed her soft pink lips. Sophie's smile deepened and her beautiful blue eyes sparkled with affection with those words. Just then Billy walked through from the kitchen, with a bucket filled with ice, and gently placed it on the table. Hey, you two lovebirds want to get a room? There's other people here, Billy said lightly, as he placed the unopened bottle of wine into the ice. Josh couldn't help but laugh at his younger brother. It was so good to see him again. We will later, he replied with a smile at Billy. You're a lucky man, Josh Seymour, Billy said quickly, as he sat back down on the leather chair. I know, Josh replied with a proud smile. He really was blessed to be with a knockout like Sophie. Well, if you two guys are finished talking about me like I'm a piece of meat, I'd like a drink, Sophie spoke up, trying to sound like she was annoyed, but Josh knew that she always liked the attention. Well. You are an amazing example of womanhood, Soph, Billy said charmingly, and Josh smiled. Here, Josh said. Sophie just smiled again at both of them. My drink then, gentlemen, she said questioningly, looking from both of them. Josh's smile broadened, and he looked over at Billy with a look to say, whatever the lady wants, before reaching over to open the bottle of wine. What a great night this was turning out to be. Firstly, he had gotten engaged to his gorgeous girlfriend, and then his younger brother came to visit. Josh was really happy as he began pouring the drinks, but he didn't realize that this was just the beginning. Billy took another sip of the fine-tasting wine. He didn't usually like the taste of wine, but his attention was not on his tasting sense, it was all focused on his eyes and ears, and they were completely focused on the stunning blonde girl sitting opposite him next to his brother. Time had passed quicker than what Billy had realized, and the wine had flowed freely. They had almost drunk 3/4 of the bottle already, but with his attention firmly fixed on Sophie and her knockout body, time just didn't seem to exist for him. The conversation had gone through the usual, and he had updated them about what had been happening in his life lately, that he wouldn't be back in service for another month, so that he could attend the wedding. That he was loving his life in the Air Force, and that he may soon be promoted in rank. Josh, of course, had continued telling him how things were going in their life, but Billy only paid half a mind to what was being said. Sophie, on the other hand, had provided more than enough entertainment, just by being herself. She hadn't done anything obvious, but Billy knew from experience when a woman was flirting with him, and Sophie Harper showed all the clear signs. While Josh had been telling him about his promotion, Sophie had been looking at Billy, and if he wasn't mistaken, or blinded by his own desire, he would have said there was a teasing look shining in her eyes. The way she had taken sips of her wine. in a slow sip whilst looking over the rim of the glass. So, where is it you're thinking of moving to? Billy asked his older brother, only paying half the attention he should have. Well, we were thinking of, was all Billy heard Josh say as Sophie interrupted his attention. Smiling at him, she took a sip from her wine before placing the glass gently on the table, and then slowly sat back and gently began to raise her arms over her head. Making herself look like she was stretching fooled Josh completely, but Billy knew his brother's fiancée was just teasing him more, and Billy had to fight to keep his jaw from falling open. All the while, Sophie continued to look at him with that teasing look in her eyes, knowing full well what kind of an effect she was having on her fiancé's brother. Billy hoped his eyes weren't too wide as he drank in the wondrous sight of her body. Sophie took her time in her stretching, before once again leaning to pick up her wineglass with a satisfied smile on her pretty face. Billy didn't know how much longer he could last, he had to find a way and soon. But just as he was thinking rapidly how to his brother's fiancée, Sophie interrupted Josh by once again placing her wineglass on the coffee table and slowly standing up. I'm just going to the bathroom, babe, I'll be right back, she said to Josh sweetly, but as she turned to walk towards the hall door, she gave Billy a teasing smile, which almost made him blow his load. So, what do you think? Billy heard Josh say suddenly, instantly dragging his attention. About what? Billy said, trying to look innocent. About the area we're going to move to. Josh answered. Oh, yeah, sounds cool, Billy replied quickly. Suddenly Josh's face took on a look that Billy couldn't quite work out the meaning of. I know what you're thinking, Billy, Josh said seriously, and suddenly panic set into Billy, but he fought it down and kept his calm. What do you mean? He replied, sounding far calmer than he had before. If Josh found out he was trying to find a way to screw his fiancée. She drives most men crazy. Josh replied. She's a big flirt, but don't worry, she's completely faithful to me, and she'd never do anything to hurt me. All of the tension suddenly left Billy as he realized what his brother was saying. Yeah, she is a knockout, I hope I can have someone like that one day, Billy said honestly, but I'm glad you can trust each other. I mean, a girl that would have every guy who sees her after her. Yeah, but they can try all they want. She loves me and no one else, Josh said, completely honest. Billy smiled at his brother, feeling relieved in one sense but disappointed in another. Josh was so sure that Sophie would never cheat on him that Billy had to agree with him. She had given no sign of wanting anything other than flirting. But he had to find a way into that. He just had to. I'm glad you found a good one, bro, you're really lucky you know, he replied, as he watched Josh smile. Then, an idea came to him and he fought even harder to hide his smile than he had to hide his nervousness. If Sophie wanted to flirt, then he'd drive her crazy with it. I'm going to have to go to the toilet, man. I think Sophie mentioning it has made me want to go. You never did have the stamina for alcohol, did you, Billy? Josh remarked with a smile. No, I think I'll go back to the coffee after this one, he replied. First door on your right at the top of the stairs. Soph will use the ensuite in our room, Josh said, as he smiled and took another drink of wine. Cheers, bro, he replied, before quickly darting out of the lounge and into the hallway. All that filled Billy Seymour's head at that point was that he was beginning on Operation Sophie Harper, and he had never failed on a mission yet. Sophie smiled as she checked her hair in the mirror above the sink, her ponytail was still perfect. Josh always loved her to have a ponytail. Just then, a thought came into her mind. I wonder if Billy would find my hair in a ponytail hot, she thought to herself. Suddenly she realized what she had thought and stopped looking at her hair, trying to force out the wondering thoughts about Josh's younger brother. Sophie tried to think about how she could get Josh to bed quickly, so he could her brains out and calm her down, but she knew that he hadn't seen Billy in ages, so he probably wouldn't go to bed for a while, trying to stop herself being frustrated, but realizing that it wasn't Josh's fault, Sophie took a deep breath and walked out of the ensuite bathroom and headed for the stairs. Smiling once again, Sophie prepared herself to tease Billy some more when she got into the lounge, but was taken by surprise, as she was walking down the stairs, by Billy walking up and meeting her halfway. "Any gentleman would let a lady pass," Sophie said to Billy, as she stood looking down at him with a playful smile on her beautiful face. "Well, I'm a perfect gentleman, so as the lady wishes," he replied, and turned sideways, giving her enough room to squeeze past. Josh's blonde fiancée looked for a moment at the small space Billy had left her to squeeze past, before once again smiling playfully at him. "Thank you, kind sir," she said playfully, and moved forward, turning to press her back against the wall as she tried to move past him on the narrow staircase. Billy smiled back at his brother's fiancée as she moved back against the wall to squeeze past him, but just as she moved directly in front of him, Billy moved and pretended to slip on the stairs. Instantly he fell forward slightly in an obviously fake fall, his strong hands gripping quickly onto Sophie's. They both remained perfectly still, looking into each other's eyes. It seemed like forever, but she spoke first. "Are you okay?" she said, sounding surprised by his actions. It had felt like forever, but in reality, it had only been seconds. "Yeah, sorry about this, I must have slipped on the stairs," he said, as he stared into her big, blue eyes. With her hands flat against the wall, she still didn't make any action to move away from him. "You slipped," she said as a playful smile once again appeared on her face. "Yeah, these stairs are really narrow, I just had to grab onto the first thing I could. I didn't want you to fall as well," he said, as he smiled charmingly at her, knowing that she didn't believe the story for 1 second. "Well, that was very gentlemanly of you," she said teasingly, "but I'm not going to fall now." Billy smiled back at her. "Thank you for making sure I was safe," she said. "No problem," he replied, "if you ever need a hand with anything, just let me know." Sophie's smile deepened and turned even more playful. "Same applies to you," she said. "Hadn't you better be going to the bathroom?" "How did you know I was going to the bathroom?" he asked. "Why else would you be coming upstairs?" she said with a satisfied smile. Billy just replied with his own knowing smile. "See you downstairs." "Big boy," Sophie said, still with that teasing satisfied smile on her face. "Unless you want to come and help," he replied, hoping that she would take him up on the offer. Instead, she just continued to smile at him playfully. "No, you're a big boy, you can handle this yourself," she answered playfully, "and like I said before, down boy." And with those words, and her smile, she turned to continue to walk down the stairs. "Now that was a bad boy," she said seriously, but still with that playful look on her face. "It was an accident," he said, trying to look innocent. "I was just moving my hand to make sure I didn't fall again, because I don't have you to grab onto if I fall again." Sophie just smiled knowingly at him, and he returned the favor. "Well, then, as I said, I'll see you downstairs, big boy," she said, her pretty playful smile returning, before she turned once again and walked the rest of the way down the stairs. Billy let out a large breath before turning to walk the rest of the way up. That had been intense. It hadn't been his original plan. He had originally planned to surprise her in the bathroom, but she had surprised him first. But there was one thing he now knew: no matter what Josh had said, no matter that Josh was his brother and Sophie was his fiancée, he was going to find a way to every way he could. He turned right at the top of the stairs. Smiling at the memory of how good taking another drink from his wine, Josh smiled to himself. Things really were great. He couldn't believe that Billy would be able to come to the wedding. He had been worried that Billy wouldn't have been able to get the time off. But now he had, and he was here. Josh had always liked talking to Billy. They had always been close in the family, especially after the arguments with his dad. But Billy had always been there for Josh, and even now it was so easy to talk to him, to tell him everything that was going on. So, Josh continued to drink from his wine, completely unaware that right at that moment brother was planning a way. Josh continued to drink while he changed over the CDs in the stereo. and smiled as he saw his loving Sophie walk in from the hallway. Sophie smiled back at Josh as she saw him sit back down and press play on the stereo remote control. She smiled warmly. She had felt it lightly press against her and had felt herself almost give in to the temptation, but she had promised herself that she would stay faithful to Josh from now on, and she would. She would just have to make sure she didn't get into a situation like that again. Calmly, she walked over to the sofa and sat next to Josh. "Did you see Billy going up the stairs?" Josh asked with a smile. "Yeah, we passed each other," she answered, trying to not let anything out of the ordinary show. "I forgot how nice of a guy he was." "Yeah, he's great," Josh replied. "I think he was a bit worried you'd cheat on me, being as gorgeous as you are." "Why would I ever do that?" "I've got you," Sophie said, hiding her shock by taking a sip of her wine. "Yeah, I know, babe," I told him, "but Billy's always been protective of all the family." "You'd think he was the older one," Josh replied without any knowledge of how close he was to the truth about his fiancée. "Yeah, he is very protective," Sophie said almost absently, as her mind drifted back to Billy. She needed, and soon. Just then the hall door opened and in walked Billy, looking calm and collected, still with that charming grin on his face that sent shivers through Sophie's body. "Hey, Billy, feel better now?" Josh joked with his brother. "Yeah, a lot better now," he answered with a quick glance at Sophie. She replied by smiling teasingly back at him over the rim of her glass. "Want a top-up? You're almost out," Josh asked, as he lifted the wine bottle up and gestured to the almost empty glass on Billy's side of the coffee table. "No, no way, I'll be going to the toilet all night if I do," Billy replied quickly. "No stomach at all," Josh jested, which earned him a look from his brother. Sophie smiled. Josh did seem to like bantering with other guys. "He's so great," she thought to herself, before looking back at Billy and taking another sip of her wine while looking playfully over the rim. "I'll have a top-up, babe," she said to Josh. "Here you go, babe," Josh said, as he began filling Sophie's glass. "I don't know, Billy, getting drunk under the table this early, shameful. I just don't want to be running to the toilet all night when I could be in such great company as you two," Billy replied, with a glance in Sophie's direction. Smiling to herself, Sophie knew exactly what "to" Josh's brother was referring to. "Well, as long as you're happy, bro," Josh said, smiling at his brother as Billy sat down. "What about another coffee?" Sophie asked both of the guys. "Yeah, what about coffee, Bill?" Josh asked his brother. "Sure, you know me, Josh, I never say no to a good offer like that," Billy answered, once again directing a look at Sophie. Sophie smiled again. Billy was flirting with her and teasing her back.